In your programs, you have a little outline there, and it should be titled Introductions. Today, we're going to introduce some stuff. Have you ever had a bad introduction?
You mean when you didn't like the person introduced you?
Well, no, where you didn't like the end result of the introduction. I was introduced to bears when our family was young. We'd go camping every summer. We'd go to Mammoth Mountain and go camping, and it was just tremendous. We have a lot of good memories from that campsite and everything. But I remember one year Jenny had made these Rice Krispie treats. And they weren't very good. They weren't. And we had them at the campsite, and nobody ate them. And pretty soon we just decided, well, we'll just chuck them. We'll throw them in the dumpster. And so we threw them in the dumpster, and lo and behold, bears came to the dumpster that night. And they were in the dumpster, and bears usually, they go into dumpsters and they get food and they leave. But we heard this bear, and he's just moaning and groaning. And I remember Jared saying, "Oh, he must have gotten to Jenny's Rice Krispie treats." I thought, I don't know. I'd say that to my, to your sister, but you kind of probably hurt her feelings. But nonetheless, we had a great introduction to bears. And the bears, it was very visible. The bears were very visible. They didn't come right down into the campsite. They just stayed out there dumpster diving. They just liked bears. They just liked the food. They just get leftover food, and they were happy. They go off on their way, and never bothered us at all. Now, a few years later, I went to the very same area, and Jared and I and one of our friends, we were backpacking, and Cindy had dropped us off, and my friend's wife, they dropped us off and left us, and it was late in the evening. In fact, it was dark, and so we just threw our sleeping bags out and propped our backpacks up against a tree and threw our sleeping bags out and went to sleep. And pretty soon we hear this growling of a bear, and it kind of reminded me of the time where at the dumpster, the growling of the bear, but there was something that was markedly different, and it was the proximity to the bear that was markedly different. And we got our flashlight out, and it's dark, you can't see anything, and we're from maybe here to Bill, and our backpacks are against a tree right there, and we flash the flashlight, and the bear's right there on our backpacks, and he's right there, and we're in sleeping bags, and I'm thinking, this is not a good place to be. And so luckily for us, we had left some pots and pans out, and so we start banging the pots and pans together, and the bear, he goes, oh yeah, and he took off. And so you would think you'd get a good night's sleep after that. Not really. We were awake all night, and the wind would blow in the trees. Where's the bear? And so that was a bad introduction to bears. Now, I don't know how you've been introduced to stuff before, but the introduction sometimes says it all. First impressions. How many chances do you get for a first impression? One. Okay, you get one chance for a first impression. So today I'm hoping that I introduce the book of 1 Timothy right to you so that you come back next week. And I hope you get an idea of what we're going to be discovering along the way. But before we do that, let me just read to you a little bit from 1 Timothy 13, 14, and 15. Now, I think I have this up here. Oh, sorry. Yep, there it is. 1 Timothy 3, 14, and 15. And you wonder, sometimes, what's the purpose for a book in the Bible? Now, this is not really a book, is it? Anybody know what it is? It's an epistle. You know what an epistle is? It's a church word for letter. It's just, we just try to fool you to make you think that we've gone to school and everything and we've learned a lot of stuff. But an epistle is just a letter. Paul wrote a letter to Timothy. Now, when you write a letter, whose name do you put first? Dear recipient. Okay, whoever you're writing to, right? And then you write all of this stuff, and then at the end you identify who you are. I've always thought that kind of weird. It would be good for me to know who the letter's from right from the get-go, so I put everything that they write to me in context. Well, that's the way Paul writes letters. That's the way it was done back in the day. You would say, dear so-and-so, I, Paul, and that's what he says. But he gives us all of this stuff, and now I won't go down that road because my goal is to be done by 11 o'clock. Or 12 o'clock, whichever you prefer. And if you're still here at 11:01, I'm going to try to stretch that baby out. Okay, now 1 Timothy 3:14 and 15, he gives us kind of the purpose for the book. He says, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you. No, he doesn't give us, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. But he's identifying about this letter here. Okay, he says, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, and here's the purpose, if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God. Have you ever seen people that didn't know how to behave? I've told you the story before when on one of our famous camping trips when we went with Bryce Mitchell Allen. Anybody know Bryce Mitchell Allen? He was this precocious 6-year-old kid. He might have been 5. Precocious 5-year-old kid, and I mean, he was all over his sister. I mean, he was just a terror. And man, I tell you, we were with those people for a week, and I thought, I can't wait to go home. That was on the second day. And we went to this laundromat to do our laundry because we were out so long that we had to do laundry. And he's just terrorizing the laundromat. I mean, terrorizing the laundromat. And a lady got up to leave, and she got all of her clothing, and she walked by me because he was kind of befriended me. And she walked by me, and she says, when are you going to do something about that kid? And I told her, I said, if he was mine, it would already be done. Trust me. But he's not mine. And she goes, oh, well, you know. But, you know, we have those kinds of things, those kinds of introductions, those kinds of things that happen to us that we want to take care of the behavior, but we just don't have the authority to do it. Now, Paul's saying here, I want you to know how people ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress for the truth. Now, he says a whole lot of stuff here. He says a whole lot of stuff, and I want to bring you back to just a couple of things that he says. He says, if I delay, I want you to know. I'm going to send you a letter, because if I was there in person, I'd tell you in person. But he says, if I'm delayed, I want you to know how one ought to behave in the household of God. So that's one of the things we're going to learn. And he's also going to tell us, which is the church of the living God. You know, how many of you think we serve a dead God? Don't raise your hand, because we don't. We serve a living God. And so he reiterates that. And he says, now this church is a pillar and a buttress for the truth. Truth. Now we're going to learn some things this next few weeks that are not going to be socially acceptable. Okay? They're not socially acceptable, but they are the truth. We're going to learn some things that you might say, oh, I don't know how that's going to fly with so-and-so, but nonetheless it's the truth, because Paul says here that the church is a buttress for the truth, a church that upholds the truth so that it can be known. Now, what does Jesus say about truth? What does the truth do to you? It sets you free. The truth sets you free. So therefore, we want to know what that truth is. Now, this is not so much about what the church is supposed to do, but it's what the church is supposed to be. Now, how many of you think that being comes before doing, or doing comes before being? Let's do the reverse of that. How many of you think that you do into being? If you just do something long enough, you will be something. Okay? That, you know, that's some common knowledge. That's the common way we think. If I just keep doing it, make it a habit, then I will be that. Okay? Now, I want you to know that in your Christian life, if that's the mentality that you have, pretty soon you become a performance-oriented person. Okay? It's all about doing. I have to do the right thing. Now, I have to read my Bible every day. I have to go to church every Sunday. I have to do this. I have to do that. And I have to do all of these things. And pretty soon, what is doing? Doing becomes a burden at that point, right? And if I do well, then it becomes a standard, right? And as a standard, I kind of uphold all this stuff, and I compare other people to me. And so I become the guru and the be-all of Christianity. Well, I want you to know that the being should come before the doing. Okay? Be something first. Now, how do you be before you do? Be is the first 2 letters of the word belief. Okay? If you believe correctly, you will be something which will motivate the doing. So focus on being before doing. Remember Mary and Martha? Jesus comes to Mary and Martha, and Mary's sitting there at the feet of Jesus, and she's just soaking in all the stuff. And Martha's in the kitchen, and she's doing the preparation for lunch, right? And Martha comes out to Jesus, and she says, why don't you have Mary come in there and help me out? And what does Jesus say to her? He says, Mary's doing the more important thing. She was doing the being part before the doing part. Now, it's important to do, isn't it? It's very important to do, but if we do before we be, then we might have the wrong motive and we might have the wrong result. So I encourage you to be something before you do something, and let that doing become a natural byproduct of the being. So we're going to talk more about that down the road. Now, becoming biblically accurate is more important than being politically correct or socially acceptable. Now, we just did a whole series on political incorrectness, right? And we talked about politics and God. So we're not afraid here at Marina Church to talk about politics. We're not afraid to talk about God. The two most avoided subjects probably known to most relationships. But today we're going to be branching out, and we're going to talk more about what the church is. And Paul and Timothy have different experiences, don't they? In fact, you might have a different experience. Paul, what's Paul to you? He's kind of the father figure, isn't he? The Apostle Paul, he's written most of the New Testament, so he's kind of the authority father figure. Timothy, on the other hand, is kind of the kid figure. Okay, and the kid figure kind of leans on the dad figure and says, help me with all of this, help me learn, help me grow, help me become what you are. And I hope you have some Paul relationships in your life. I hope you have some Timothy relationships in your life too, because your job is to pass on your faith. Okay, pass on your faith. And sometimes we think, well, it's a very personal thing to me, and I don't talk about my faith to anybody else. Well, I hope it is very personal, but I hope it is not private. I want your faith to be something that is public. I want it to be something that you display. I want it to be something that you let people know about, and something that you live. Now, Frank Peretti, he's a Christian author. Anybody read any Frank Peretti books? Frank Peretti is a terrific author, and he's written some really great nonfiction stuff. But he has this comment that he makes about the need for biblical absolutes in our society today. We need biblical absolutes. And he kind of draws a parallel between the need for biblical absolutes and rules for a playground. Now, Mrs. Kravitz is the lady on the playground, and she's the attendant there. And she makes sure that everybody abides by the rules. You can use the swing set for 5 minutes, and then if somebody's waiting in line, you need to let somebody else have a turn. You can do tetherball for 10 minutes, and after that, you need to let somebody else have a turn. And you need to have all of these rules. You can't run where you're not supposed to run. You shouldn't get near the swing sets because you might get kicked. And so there's rules. Now, when Mrs. Kravitz is not there, what do you think happens? Chaos happens. In fact, who rules the playground then? The biggest, meanest bully on the playground runs the playground, right? And he says that's what happens in our world today when we don't have biblical absolutes that everybody recognizes and that everybody adheres to as the standard for truth. Now, you can see that in our society today, can't you? You can see how the biggest, meanest, whoever gets the most vote, they win. Whoever has the most power, it's their rules. Whoever does the most of this gets the best recognition. So it's kind of the playground without the rules, whereas biblical absolutes are the rules that help us to function in society properly. Now, Mrs. Kravitz, when somebody would break the rules, what would she do? She'd give them a pink slip and time out or do whatever. Now, we don't have the ability to do that in our world today. Have you ever seen people, though, in the world that you'd like to say, I'd like to give that guy a timeout? Somebody that's maybe driving down the freeway a little too forcefully. Maybe a little bit too enraged. That guy needs a timeout. And wouldn't it be good to just go up and say, hey, take a timeout, dude? And they would do that. No, they don't do that. We don't have the ability to do that. But what we do have the ability to do is uphold the truth. And that's what we want to discover in the next few weeks. And that's what we want to portray. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it says this. Let me make sure that In 1 Timothy 1 and 2, it says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by command of God our Savior and of Christ Jesus our hope, to Timothy. Now, this is the beginning of his letter, right? So he identifies first who he is. Okay, he says, I'm Paul, and he says several things about himself. Now he says in verse 2, I'm going to address this to Timothy, my true child in the faith. Grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Lord. Now let's find out the main characters, and let's get an introduction to them. First of all, we have the Apostle Paul. Now, anybody know what word apostle means? Apostle? It's the Greek word apostello. Does that help? No. Apostle is a person who is sent with a message. Now, if I told one of you, I want you to go over to the church over here that meets over here behind us, and I want to give you a message. I want you to send them our greetings and say, we want God to bless your church. Okay, what would you be? You'd be an apostle. You'd be an apostle. You'd be one sent with a message, right? Paul says that he is an apostle of who? Of Jesus Christ. He's come to announce the message of Jesus Christ. Now, what other word do we have that would be akin to the message of Jesus Christ? Starts with a G, ends with ospel. Gospel. There you go. I knew you'd get that. You guys are sharp. Gospel. Okay? It's the gospel that Jesus had given to the Apostle Paul, the gospel. Now, check this out. What does Paul do with that? He started church after church after church after church after church after church. He didn't start one church. He started church after church after church after church. And he said, the gospel is good for everyone, so I need to get it in the place where I can get the gospel to everyone. So he started churches. He was a man sent with a message. Now today, we kind of have political apostles. Did you know that? They're called ambassadors. Ambassadors, and they go to other countries, they kind of reside there, and they're our liaison. They're the people that we count on to deliver the message of the United States in whatever circumstance we find in the world surrounding us. And so our ambassadors are kind of like apostles sent with the message of the United States of America. But Paul says here that he's an apostle of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, there was a 2nd century writer that described Paul. How many of you think of Paul as kind of this tall, good-looking, handsome guy that, had a commanding presence when he spoke? Everybody went, wow. No, he wasn't that. Now, here's what he said about him. The 2nd century writer, he described Paul as being short, bald, with crooked legs, and a hooked nose. Now, that's not, don't point to me when I say that. Now, I don't look anything like Paul. But what he didn't have a commanding presence, did he? But man, he was a man of spiritual giganticness. Because the same writer goes on and he refers to Paul as full of friendliness, and he had the face of an angel. Now, here, how many of you think of angel when you hear this? Short, bald, crooked legs, hooked nose. No, but have you ever seen somebody that wasn't that all attractive on the outside, but once you got to know them, they were very attractive on the inside? The inner beauty of a person goes so far to overcome the physical attributes that may not be all that complimentary. And so Paul had that ability. He was a spiritual giant, and he had the face of an angel, and he was full of friendliness. Now, whatever he was physically, spiritually, he was far more. Now let's take another look at a guy named Timothy. Okay, Timothy was a kid who had mom's voice in his ear all the time. Have you ever had that? How many of you cringe when you hear your middle name? Yeah, I kind of do too. I remember one time we were out looking at houses. David and Jenny are my son and daughter-in-law, or my daughter and son-in-law. I love Dave so much, I called him my son. I know, but Jenny would be heartbroken if she knew I called her my daughter-in-law. So don't zip your lips. Okay, now, we were out looking for homes one time. They were getting ready to buy a house, and we were out there. And my mom lives in the Midwest. She lives in Missouri. And so I don't hear her voice. Except this one day, I heard her voice. And we were in this room, and we had looked at, how many of you have ever just gotten tired of looking at houses? And so you try to create your own fun. And that's kind of a moniker of the McCamey name sake, is that you create your own fun. And so we're in there, and Jenny and I are in the bedroom, and I think Dave's off in the bathroom, and Cindy's off in a closet in this master bedroom. And I looked at Jenny, and she looked at me like, oh, what's he about to do? And I just did this big dive backwards onto the bed. No big deal, huh? Except those aren't real beds. It's like a frame, a box frame, and when I landed on this thing, it went kaboom! I mean, you could hear it through the entire house. I thought, oh, this thing's going to collapse or whatever. I'm going to get knocked out. And I heard immediately from the closet, Michael Donovan, what did you do? I mean, it was audible. It was audible. And I thought, my mom's here. And then Cindy emerges. And I went, oh. Now, I'm not saying she became my mom at that point, but you have that voice in your head, don't you? You have the mom voice in your head reminding you of how to behave, reminding you of the right and wrong, reminding you of what makes her proud and what does not make her proud. And so therefore you have that voice. Timothy had that voice in his head as well. Notice actually I don't have this for you, but I have it in my notes. You might want to jot it down. 2 Timothy 1:5. Paul writes of Timothy, he says, I have been reminded of your sincere faith. Now, where did you think Timothy's faith came from? Well, he tells us, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. Now, he had two generations of faith that had been passed on to him. Now, I would like for you to do a little exercise this next week and just kind of say, where did my faith come from? The things I believe about God, where did they come from? And kind of chart that back. See how far back it goes. Mine goes back to my grandfather. As far back as I can tell. My grandfather had a great influence on my spirituality. Now, it's kind of funny because he lived in the Midwest. I never saw him until until I was 10 years old. I was 10 years old when I first laid eyes on my grandfather that I can remember. But I remember him coming out here from the Midwest. And now, here's how profound his influence was. He had such an influence that I didn't even know he was influencing me when he influenced me. Because my parents, both of them smoked at the time. But I noticed something strange. When my grandfather would come, all of a sudden they didn't smoke anymore. Kind of interesting. I didn't know any difference, but I noticed. And then when my grandparents would go back home, my parents started smoking again. Okay, I kind of liked it when they didn't, but whatever. So that happened, and he was influencing. He came out one year, and there was a church meeting that was going on. He took my dad. My grandfather took my dad to this meeting. My dad had an experience with Christ, gave his life to become a follower of him, and all of a sudden, everything changed. We quit smoking. And we went to church every time the church was open. And I'd never been to church hardly at all. I'd gone a couple of times to a Methodist church and could barely remember that. But man, now every time the church was open, I was there. And I liked it. I had a great time. And that was the beginning of this heritage of influence. My parents, man, they got their act together and they started teaching me stuff. And I remember in Sunday school one time we were talking about sin, and my Sunday school teacher said, "You are all sinners." And I said, "Well, yeah, my mom tells me that all the time." But the truth of the matter was, it started to check with me, started to register with me that I know what sin is now. It's not just doing bad stuff. It's doing things that I know are right to do and not doing those things. Knowing what's right to do and not doing it. And man, that started to change me and mold me and shape me. And my grandfather was the initiator of all of that to my parents, to me. I've passed that on to my kids who are passing that on to my granddaughter. And I mean, we have 5 generations of things happening here because of what my grandfather did. I'm thankful to my grandfather. I'm thankful that he had faith. I'm thankful that he passed it on to succeeding generations. I'm glad that I was a recipient. I'm glad that I could pass that on. I hope you have a heritage of faith, and you can start that. If you don't have a long heritage of faith, start a long heritage of faith and start passing your faith along to other people. That's what had happened with Timothy. Now, Timothy, he was born in Lystra. Anybody know where Lystra is? It's in Turkey. Okay, he first preached the gospel there and kind of in his hometown. His father was a Gentile. His mother was a Jew. Now, how do you think that rang with the Jewish people? Not good. Not good. He was a half-breed. And so, Paul recognized, though, the giftedness that Timothy had, and he wanted Timothy to become active in the faith and active in leading. And he knew that there was going to be a big roadblock here because the Jews would not accept him. So what does Paul do for Timothy? He circumcised him as an adult without anesthesia. I'm just saying. I don't want that to mar your mind here in church, but he does. And he does that so that Timothy would be accepted by the Jewish people, which he was. And Paul would herald him. He would recommend him. He did all kinds of things. He was gifted for ministry. Now, there's 3 things that we find about Timothy that would behoove us to practice as we start this study of 1 Timothy. The first thing is that he was a learner. Anybody here know a know-it-all? Yeah, I've told you my know-it-all people. Cindy's dad was a know-it-all. He knew everything and told me everything. But then when he passed away, I thought, oh no, we've lost the wealth of all knowledge. But soon Cindy's brother, he took up that mantle, and he was the know-it-all. And they didn't know that I was the know-it-all. But what's the problem with a know-it-all? They know it all. So their cap on learning has been suppressed. Okay, it's on them. They have no room for learning anything else. Does anybody know everything? No. Do you think that you know stuff I don't know? Yeah, you do. You know stuff I don't know. Do I know stuff you don't know? We make a great... No, probably not. James, thank you. But the truth of the matter is that we could all be a great team, couldn't we? If we pooled our knowledge, we would know far more together than we know individually. Now, the problem with a know-it-all is that they know it all and they learn nothing more. They learn nothing more because they know it all already. And so they don't become learners. Now, Timothy was a learner. In 1 Corinthians 4:16 through 17, here's what Paul writes to the church at Corinth about him. He says, I urge you then, be imitators of me. He says, I want you as a church to be an imitator of me, Paul the Apostle. That's why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways as I teach them everywhere in every church. Now, if Timothy was able to remind them of the ways of Paul, he'd obviously learned them, hadn't he? And so therefore he learned them for the purpose of projecting them and for teaching them, for passing them on. So you don't learn stuff just for you, okay? There are people around you who need to know some of the stuff that you know. Some of the stuff, keep to yourself. But some of the stuff, you need to pass that on. So rather than claiming to know it all, he was able to learn. Now, learning allows us to grow, doesn't it? If you don't learn something new, you don't grow. You don't grow. So learning is very valuable, very important. Knowing it all stymies our growth. So Timothy was a learner. I encourage you to do likewise. Be a learner. He was also a laborer. Okay, he worked. He worked really, really, really hard. In Philippians 2:22 through 24, again, Paul writing to the church at Philippi, he says, but you know Timothy's proven worth. How as a son with a father, he has served with me in the gospel. Now, in these days, most sons grew up in the vocation that their father was. Okay, if your dad was a carpenter, you grew up to be a carpenter because that's what he taught you. If he was a herder of sheep or goats, you became a herder of sheep or of goats. If he was a planter, you became an agriculturalist. You became a farmer. And so whatever the family heritage was, is what the sons would become. Now, Paul's claiming Timothy here, and so he's saying, man, I'm a preacher of the gospel, and I want Timothy to do likewise, and I want you guys to know here at the church Philippi that that's what he has served with me in the gospel doing. He says, I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. Okay, and he's being held in captive there. And he says, and I trust the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. He says, man, I can't come right now, but I'm going to send you somebody who's tested, tried, and proven, and it's Timothy. And he's going to work just as hard as if I was there with you. Now, labor many times is seen as going out and working. But what Paul's writing here about is labor as service to people. Service to people. I want him to come and I want him to teach you stuff. I want him to serve you by helping you grow in your faith. Now there's a third thing that he was. He was a liaison. Okay? Now, a lot of times Paul couldn't go where he wanted to go. We see examples of that already. And he couldn't go, so he would send Timothy to go and help the people. And then he expected Timothy to come back and report what was going on so that his life could be blessed as well. In Philippians 2:19, he says, I probably need to go one more. Nope, I don't. 2:19, it says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. And I'm going to send somebody to your house because I can't come, but I want them to come back and tell me how good you're doing. That's what Paul's saying. I want them to come back so that I can be cheered by that good news. Now, in order to be a liaison, there's a couple of qualities that you have to have. One of them is trustworthiness. You have to be trustworthy, because I'm going to send you with a message. I expect you, and I trust you to deliver that properly. The second thing that I expect of you is dependability. When I tell you to go, I want you to go. When I tell you to come back, I want you to come back. I need to depend on you, because there's a liaison that happens here, and it goes two ways, and I need to benefit just as much as they. Now, what Paul did with Timothy is he didn't just send him across town. He sent him to faraway places, and it's interesting because we think faraway places as what? Some place where there's no cell phone reception. That's a faraway place, isn't it? And somebody's far away from me when I can't get them by cell phone. But there were no cell phones, so far away wasn't quite as far as maybe we would consider. And there was transportation problems. Okay, people didn't travel via plane. They didn't drive cars. They took the Cadillac, and they maybe at best, and came back. But it still took time. There was time. There was distance. There was danger. And so, therefore, when Paul's using Timothy as a liaison, his dependability and his trustworthiness was vital to him. Now, do you think that Timothy could have felt inadequate? If Paul had asked you to do some of the things he's asked Timothy to do, would you have a little bit of fear and trepidation maybe? Timothy, if you read and study about Timothy, he's described as maybe being a bit timid. And he had stomach problems to boot. Okay, Paul instructs him to take a little wine for his stomach. And so we see Timothy as being probably not what we would consider the first resort to go to when Paul's not available. But Paul saw him as somebody who was dependable and trustworthy and capable. Now, do you sometimes feel inadequate at the job God asks you to do? Yeah. Do you think Timothy did? Yeah. Was Timothy capable? Yeah. Are you capable? Oh, that wasn't quite as loud as the others, But we are, aren't we? Because we can do all things through Christ who does what? Gives us strength. Okay, we can do all things. Do we believe that, or is that just kind of a neat verse? So most of the time it's just kind of a neat verse, let's be honest. Because we say, I can't do that. I remember when I was growing up, the first thing that I said when I was called to do public speaking was, I can't do that. I was willing to take an F in my English class in my senior year of high school because I wouldn't speak in front of a group. Kind of an interesting, when I think back on my history, it's kind of interesting now that I just can't seem to stop. I don't know, much to your chagrin. Okay, now let's look at something else here in our introduction, and that is the purpose of the letter. Back before the age of electricity, this old farmer was getting on this young kid because he was going to visit his girlfriend, and he was carrying a lantern. And the old farmer said to the kid, back in my day, we didn't carry one of those lanterns to go visit our girl. What are you doing? Kind of calling him a sissy. And so the young kid looks at the old farmer. He says, yeah, maybe you should have. Look at what you got. Now, the point of the story is if you're going to lead, make sure that you know what you're doing. Okay? Our world is making decisions in the dark, isn't it? Our world is making decisions. Wouldn't it be good to have a lantern, to light the way so that you can make enlightened decisions? Okay, if you have a light. Now that's what Paul says the church is. That's what Paul says the truth is. It's a light to show how we can make our best decisions. Now our world believes that there is no absolute truth. In fact, there's some Gallup poll statistics that say 70% of people in America agree with this statement. And here's the statement. There are few moral absolutes. Few moral absolutes. 70% of Americans believe that. Do you think that there are more than a few moral absolutes? Yeah, there are. Here's another statement. What is right or wrong usually varies from situation to situation. Situational ethics. How many people in America agree with that statement? 90%. 73%. It's not as bad as we think. 73%. How many of you revere Dan Rather, the news anchor? Dan Rather. Man, I used to, until I read this about him. Remember when President Clinton was being accused of lying? Okay? He was being accused of lying. Here's what Dan Rather said about that in defense of President Clinton. He says, I think you can be an honest person and lie about any number of things. You can be, thank you. You can be an honest person, but yet lie about any number of things. I don't believe that. That is not true. But yet in defense of some people that we love and we respect and we honor, maybe, people say those kinds of things. You can be an honest person and lie. Doesn't make sense to me. And that's the world that we live in. Now, what's the purpose of the book of 1 Timothy? Here's the first one. It is to guard the truth. Okay, did that get there? Oh, there we go. To guard the truth. Okay, here's the reason for the book. In 1 Timothy 6, 20 through 21. O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. For by professing it, some have swerved from the faith. Okay? There's stuff out there that is purported to be true, and we kind of buy into that. We're going to talk about some of that stuff here in just a minute. Okay, there's another flip side to this, okay? To guard the truth and to avoid falsehood. Now, if you didn't see that one earlier, that's what it is. Okay? 1 Timothy 4, 1 through 3 says, Now the Spirit expressly says that in the later times, some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. In other words, false teachers. People. And now, where does the threat come from? From our world? Does false teaching come from our world? It does. However, Paul's really talking about here false teaching that comes from within the church. So we have to know the truth in order to be able to tell if the truth is being taught to us. So know the truth and test everything I teach you through that lens, through that sieve. Okay, verse number 2. Through the sincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Okay, so there's some people that come, and do we need to do that? Yep. There are some people that come in and will teach you, we need to abstain from certain foods. We need to be vegetarians. Okay, and I prefer that you be vegan, and so therefore we need to go back to foods that are whole and healthy and good for us. Now, how many would you be here? How many of you would be here for our next potluck? That's why I don't teach that. But no, because that's a teaching that goes beyond what the Scripture says. And there are some people that will take. What was the problem with the Jewish legal system? The law. They'd taken some rules and they had extrapolated from them, hadn't they? And they said, okay, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Okay, they took one of the big 10. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Now, here's how you're going to keep it holy. You're not going to work. Okay, don't do any work. That's good. Okay, and we're going to say work constitutes walking more than X number of steps. So therefore, you can't walk more than X number of steps outside your household. Now, they realized very quickly that was kind of a bummer for them because it prevented some of their commerce, actually, is what they were having trouble with. And so what they did was, around Jerusalem, they put a big rope. They had this rope that surrounded Jerusalem, and they said, now this is our house. Interesting, isn't it? How we can create rules, and we go, that didn't work. Well, let's create a bigger rule here. Let's create an addendum to the rule. And so they extrapolated from what is true and what God had said. Now, we in the church oftentimes run across people that will take what God has said and they'll make specific applications as if they are law. Applications are not law. The law is the truth of the Word of God. And so therefore, be careful about how that happens. Let's take a look at one last thing here, and that is our battlefield. Okay, our battlefield in the Christian life is not debating issues like are chairs better than pews. If we had a regular church building, we'd all be sitting here and we'd have a business meeting, and we'd have a business meeting to decide, well, do we want our new church to have chairs or pews? And don't say a word about that, because chairs and pews, it evokes a certain thing in you, doesn't it? My history was back when we had pews. I remember one time I was in a church and we had a big wooden, they call them pulpits, a wooden pulpit. we decided that was kind of a barrier between the speaker and the audience. And so what we got was an acrylic one that you could see through it, so it wasn't such a barrier, and there was a better connection. And a lady came up to me, she says, "Now, Pastor Mike, I know that new pulpit is nice and that you like it, but could we just get the wooden one and put it, you don't have to use it. You don't have to use it. Could we just put it up on the side?" You don't get the humor there, do you? I'm thinking, why do we want to put something up that we're not going to use? But it was just my affinity for that. And so we spent a lot of time doing that kind of stuff. We had an organ in one church, and nobody knew how to play the organ. We hadn't used the organ in, years. And we moved it off to the side so that we could extend the stage for a production. And people got worried, what are we going to do about that organ? I have comfort with the organ, and we need the organ. I don't know why. We hadn't played it for years, but we needed it. And so we have that thing. Now, that's not where the Christian battle is fought. It's not fought over those things. It's not about whether we're going to sing hymns or choruses. It's not fought over music. It's not fought over the name of the church. It's not fought over whether we should go to public school or Christian school. That's not where the fight is. You know what the fight is? The fight is over the theological teachings that permeate our society. The emergent church, and I don't know if you've read much about the emergent church, but the emergent church teaches that we don't really need the gospel, because in the end, everybody goes to heaven. Everybody goes to heaven. So therefore, why worry about sin? Why worry about anything? Everybody's going to end up there anyway. Let's just have a social club. And let's get together and have a good time. And let's eat a lot. And let's just play games. And let's do stuff. But I believe that the truth is that there is sin in the world. And sin separates us from God. And Jesus came to the earth to die on a cross to pay the penalty for that sin. If the emergent church is right and everybody ends up in heaven anyway, Jesus wasted his time. And he wasted his death on the cross. And I don't believe he wasted anything. Now that's where the battle is fought. Open theism. Open theism is a force in the theological world today that says that God really isn't concerned about the future. He just kind of spun the world, threw it out there, and he's going to come back sometime. And he's not really concerned about the future, and he doesn't really know what's going on here in this world today. He's not a personal God. And so it repudiates the omniscience of God, the all-knowing power of God. I believe that God is all-knowing. He knows the number of hairs on your head. You left some of them on your pillow. He's already calculated for that. He's calculated for that already. He knows how many I have. Doesn't take him long there. Okay. Now, there's another group of people out there. We call them progressive creationists. Progressive creationists believe that God used evolution to create the world. He used evolution to create the world. I remember thinking when I was a kid, I thought, I was trying to balance those two things. I was trying to make them mesh, because I'd been taught in school that evolution is the way, but I knew that God created. And so I tried to merge those two things. And I rapidly became a creationist that believed in progressive creationism and progressive stuff. And so I got all messed up. And pretty soon I couldn't justify, the account in the Bible. And that's what progressive creationists are teaching, is that God used that evolutionary process to create what we now have. Well, the Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth, and he did it in 7 or 6 days and rested on the seventh. That's what it says. And when it says day there, it's not talking about 1,000 years. He says from sun up to sunset. Actually, from sunset to sun up. Or from sunset to sunset as a day. And so therefore he's talking about a 24-hour day. So that's where the battle is. Knowing what the battle is important for us. Because there's this thing about knowing about Jesus and believing in Jesus. Now you know about knowing about, right? You've heard the name Jesus. You've heard his story. You've heard all this stuff. But believing in him means that you trust in him, you rely upon him, and you've committed yourself to him. That's what belief in the Bible is talking about. Stuart Briscoe, in a book he wrote, talks about this pastor who was officiating at a veterans funeral. And some of his buddies had wanted to kind of participate in the service, and they asked the pastor if he would lead them down to the casket, and then they would stand there and observe a couple of moments of silence, and then if he would just lead them off and out the side door. And the pastor said, yeah, I'll do that. I think that would be appropriate. And so they got ready, and the pastor leads them in, and he comes down the aisle, and they get to the casket, and they all turn around, and they observe a moment of silence. And then as that concludes, the pastor leads them off the stage and out the side door. Well, they hadn't really rehearsed this. The side door was a broom closet from which there was no exit. And they kind of shuffled, and they're trying to be military, and they're trying to be official and proper and do all that stuff. And there was just a great deal of confusion. And they finally found another door. Actually, the funeral director says that. And so they went over there, and they went out the door. Now, the point of the story is, if you're going to lead, know where you're going. Know where you're going. If you're going to lead in your faith, know where you're going. And that's what we're going to be discovering in the next several weeks as we study through the book of 1 Timothy. We want to lead people to their faith and to demonstrating their faith and living their faith, but we need to know where we're going before we do that. Now, I hope this has been a sufficient introduction for you. And I hope that it's enough to wet your whistle to come back next week to learn more about what Paul teaches his young fledgling pastor, Timothy, to do.